going. So welcome to the California Fire Science Seminar Series. I'm Crystal Colvin at University of California, Merced. My co-organizers and co-hosts are Dr. Jeanette Kobianiniquez from University of California, Merced, and Dr. Michael Gallner from University of California, Berkeley. This seminar series is also co-sponsored and presented by the California Fire Science Consortium, there we go, and is fiscally sponsored by UC Berkeley. So we appreciate all the sponsorship and sharing, and appreciate all of you that have come back week after week. Speaking of week after week, I do want to make a quick announcement before we get going. Normally this seminar is at 3 p.m. every single week. Next week, we have a very special time for this seminar. We're very lucky to be hosting Dr. Christine Erickson, who many of you may know of her work that has occurred in Australia on gender and fire, and Indigenous fire for quite a few years now, and she has recently moved to Switzerland. So she is quite a few hours ahead of us here on the West Coast. So we have moved next week's seminar only next week to 10 a.m. Pacific time. So we know for many of you that's a slight challenge, and we apologize for that. This is the only way that we could include Dr. Erickson in the seminar series. And as always, it will be recorded and available on our website. So next week, 10 a.m., every other week, 3 p.m. Pacific as normal. And if you haven't joined us before, this is a webinar format Zoom. So you are unable to speak or turn on your video during the webinar so that we don't have any interruptions to our speakers. If you have questions, please put them in the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. There should be a toolbar, and on that toolbar, there's a little Q&A button. Please do not put your questions in the chat. Use the Q&A, and we will take questions at the end. There is also, of course, the discussion after the main webinar, and we will have the link for the chat, or I'm sorry, the link for the discussion in the chat window as we get towards the end of the webinar. So look for that. It's also in the email that gets sent out, and we will luckily be joined by our speakers today in the discussion session. So, okay, with all of that out of the way, we are absolutely delighted to host our three speakers today, who are all joining us from the Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, where they work on different aspects of wildfire. And I'm going to introduce all three of them right off the top, and then I'm going to let them take over to go through their process of speaking about their work. So our three speakers, and I am hoping I don't do too bad of a job on your names here. Zelalem, I hope that's right, close anyway. Right. Zelalem Mekonnen is a terrestrial ecosystem modeler across scales and works on soil plant atmosphere interactions and ecosystem responses, and is currently looking at ecosystem processes that control changes in plant functional types and associated feedbacks to the climate system with a various set of relevant components. Qing Zhu is a research scientist who works on global carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus cycles, and has participated in a variety of global projects associated with that, to develop and evaluate new global carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus cycles and interaction modules for modeling work. And then Maegen Simmons is a soil and ecosystems biogeochemist, modeler, and data scientist who looks at long-term sustainability of ecosystems and informing that through best management practices, decision-making, and policy. She focuses on terrestrial ecosystem processes, including exchange of greenhouse gases, with the land atmosphere exchange, predicting effects of climate, wildfire, soil plant properties, and land management. And currently she is working with others to develop the California Natural and Working Lands Carbon and Greenhouse Gas Model. And there's quite a bit more detail on each of our speakers on our website with links to their specific websites at LBNL. Oops, there we go. And hopefully I can get out of my screen here. There we go, sorry. So without further ado, I believe we're going to start with Dr. Mekonnen here, and I will let the three of you take it away.
Okay, thank you. I'll share the screen.
Perfect.
Okay, good. All right, hi everyone. Today I'll be presenting about some of the wildfire activities in high latitude ecosystems that we've been doing over the past years. So there have been amplified warming in the high latitude regions of the Arctic and the boreal forests over the past decades. And this rate of warming is twice as global average. And with climate warming, there's also subsequent increases in disturbance, particularly increases in frequency and intensity of wildfires. And the figure in the right is from a recent study that shows projected increases in lightning flash rates that may lead to more wildfires over the 21st century. And one of the most important ecosystem responses driven by wildfire and climate warming is change in vegetation composition, which may alter the existing or past one stable state to another alternative stable states. So change in high latitude vegetation can happen in two ecosystems of the high latitude regions. One is the Arctic, and the other one is a boreal forest. The Arctic ecosystem is a treeless ecosystem mostly underlain by permafrost, and is dominated by graminoids, nebvascular plants, and shrubs. And fire is less frequent in this ecosystem. And the ongoing Arctic shrubfication is expected to be amplified under future climate and also with more wildfires. But the boreal forest is a little bit different. It's dominated by trees and it's also mostly dominated by black spruce. And disturbance is one of the major ecosystem drivers in boreal forest. So how does fire affect vegetation change or post-fire successional trajectory? And what are the key modeled processes? Looking into the modeled processes, our model called ecosys is, if you see the figure on the right, on the left, those are the processes represented in the model. And looking this in the context of the conceptual framework of historical, physiological, and biotic filters that determine species composition from Lambert's 2008. There are three major processes which are shown to be really important, not only in cold climates like high latitude regions, but also elsewhere like California. The first one is the historical filters. Is the basic question of do PFT seeds arrive, which means or is there any dispersal barrier for a species to arrive post disturbance, assuming stand replacing fire? The second one is an important process is a physiological filters. That is, can it germinate or can it grow? This happens the first few years after fire, and also after successful seed arrival. In our model, we have processes, parameters that control seed germination rates of different PFTs based on the literature, although there are these processes are pretty uncertain. And the third and the most important one is a biotic filter. Does it successfully compete after establishment? And this is an important stage for fire-climate interactions. In the model, coupled processes of controlled nutrient dynamics through basic process nutrient transformation processes, derived successional dynamics, and also determined by nutrient and light competition, and through differences in PFT traits. So climate warming has its own role here. It enhances mineralization, and more nutrients means it benefits more fast-growing PFTs with higher nutrient demand compared to more conservative plants like evergreen trees and shrubs. Light competition is also very important, but it became more important later at the successional stage. Okay, one of the key results from our modeling experiments about climate-fire interaction is changes in vegetation composition that favor fast-growing deciduous PFTs, such as aspen in the boreal forest and tall deciduous shrubs in the tundra. As you can see from the figure, the first row is modeled NPP, and the second row is modeled nitrogen uptake with and without fire for evergreens and deciduous PFTs. You can see that under different combinations of climate and fire, the shift in the relative dominance of vegetation happened when only wildfire and warmer climates interact, and it only happens under these conditions. So these are the maps, for instance, that shows change in relative dominance of evergreens and deciduous plants in simulations with and without fire through 2100 compared to the current conditions. And you can see that these two simulations have different spatial patterns of PFT distribution. The evergreens were modeled to be the dominant PFT in much of Alaska under current climates and also under future climates, but in the absence of fire. But the interaction of these two climate and wildfire resulted in the shift in PFT. And we modeled that aspen will dominate the boreal forest under warmer climates, and also shrubs will dominate much of the Arctic tundra, amplifying the ongoing Arctic shrubification. I want to stress that one of the most important plant traits is the nitrogen use efficiency when you model nutrient vegetation dynamics. The modeled nitrogen use efficiency defined as the ratio of annual GPP to annual nitrogen uptake. We compared to deciduous and herbaceous plants, evergreens were modeled to fix more carbon per leaf nitrogen invested. And this is very important because it enables them to compete more effectively under nitrogen limited condition. And that's why they are dominant PFT under current condition. However, more fast growing and less conservative PFTs such as deciduous PFTs will benefit more from increased nutrient availability from warmer climates. And this is really key to model how nutrient dynamics affect vegetation change under future climates. So to say something about another important question of how does fire affect the ecosystem carbon balance and the different components of the carbon exchange, such as GPP, NPP, and overall carbon budget. Here's the figures that show the spatial average GPP and NPP across burned pixels in Alaska with different numbers of fire events. We have like 5 categories, 1 to 5 in 2000 versus 2100. And the figures show that the model GPP and NPP increased under future climates in all simulations with different number of fires. And here, the figure shows spatial average changes in liter carbon and NPP which means the values were subtracted from pixels in simulations without fire from the simulations with fire across the burned pixels with different number of fire events. You can see from the figure that the ecosystem liter input increased under future climates in simulations with fire. And this is particularly driven by increases in the CDS fraction of the PFT dynamics, which I was talking about earlier. And the modeled NPP, however, in the fire simulations was dependent on the number of fire events, which means higher, or the change is higher in less frequent fire, and there's a decline. There's actually a decline under more frequent fires. The other thing is the change in soil organic carbon stock. This is a figure that shows the soil organic carbon pools, which shows a reduction in the fire simulations and the amount of reduction increased with fire frequency. And this reduction in soil organic carbon pool is attributed to two things. The first one is directly by combustion losses, and the second one is indirectly by changes in vegetation, or driven by more deciduous plants that accelerated decomposition rates. We estimated that the carbon emission from the fire would more than doubles as a result of it by 2100, just under the scenario of 70% increase in burned area. So you can see that more fire or more burned area will ultimately result in loss of carbon to the ecosystem. We have more detailed analysis going on currently about how different fire intensities and also different burned area affects overall carbon balance of the Alaskan ecosystems. Thanks so much. I think yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. And we'll go ahead and please continue to put your questions in the Q&A. And now we'll go ahead and turn it over to, I think Qing is up next.
Can you see my slides?
Yes.
All right. Thanks for this opportunity. So I will continue Zelalem's topic on wildfire, but move it a little bit to a different scale, which is a global scale. And but also I think the idea behind this modeling work and also the workflow also applicable to the Western US and to the California that our whole group will be more interested in. So for global fire, a little bit background. Fire happens everywhere, but due to different reasons, there are different dynamics. For example, for the Western US, you see it's getting drier and drier, and so the fire risk gets higher and higher. That's what we see happening in the recent decades. But if we zoom out and look at global dynamics, it's the fire activity is actually declining all the time during the past 3 decades, mainly because of the major wildfire is over the tropics, and the tropical wildfire is suppressed by human activity, a denser population, more livestock density, and more the cropland land use change, and so and also the grazing, and so wildfire activity is a regional issue, and which is also very complicated and driven by human and also climate. And there are basically 2 approaches to translate these knowledge into a predictive model, so that we can know what's going to happen in the near future and also in the long-term future. So we can either build a machine learning model based on whatever current data sets we have, and then train a relationship between inputs and outputs, which output is the variable of interest, maybe the burn area or maybe the carbon emission. Or we can, based on this knowledge, and then build a few physical equations, mathematical equations that that has our physical knowledge built already in the model, and then make the prediction to say under the climate change, on the warming, on the dry condition, on the more human activity, what's going to happen in the near future. But both approach has their own drawbacks. So the idea of this work is to sort of combine them together and come up with a integrated framework that can give us a better physical constraint and together with a higher prediction accuracy. So the science question for us is we already have a physical model in the DOE's E3SM land model, a Wildfire model, and we can do a short-term and long-term prediction, but we know the issue is the accuracy. So the spatial pattern, temporal trend, and seasonality, all kinds of different issues, different accuracy issues. So we know the model is biased. But then we want to ask how machine learning, so the other data-driven approach, can help us to further improve this physical model. And the approach we take is that we look into the physical model component by component and figure out the major inputs are ignition, anthropogenic suppression, field conditions, and climate factors. We know that those are the 4 important driving groups of driving variables. And we are interested more in the burn area, and we are also working on the emission right now, but this work is for the burn area. And the difficulty here is in the physical model, we prescribe the relationship. So, for example, when the precipitation increase, first the wildfire will increase because you have more fuel to burn during the dry period. But when the precipitation further increase, then the system gets drier, gets wetter, and then suppress the wildfire during the dry period. So we sort of prescribe that relationship already in the physical model and make it run. But what we don't know is this relationship parameterized effectively, and also it's also very hard to parameterize a global scale model, even though we know there are observations out there. So the approach we take is we believe this model structure, and then we take inputs and outputs and all those components, and then surrogate the relationship between inputs and outputs using a deep neural network, so that we have sort of some constraint on the functional relationship between output and input, but we don't rely on the exact shapes. We still use global large-scale data sets to fine-tune those functional relationships, make sure the model predictability is largely improved. So here is what we did step by step. First step is to run the E3SM physical model, Wildfire model, and we generate all those inputs and outputs, and also the intermediate variables for the machine learning model to use. And now we can see here the red line is the observation GFAT for burn area data sets, and the ELM is the black line. We see that globally it's probably fine in terms of capturing the declining trend, also so some of the interannual variability, but spatially it's not that reasonable. We have overestimate over non-tropical region and underestimate over tropical region. So we know the model is first order, right? But for specific region and specific time period is not that right. So second step, we take a GFAT Wildfire regions. So there are 14 regions in total, and build a machine learning surrogate model for each of the regions using the data that we generate from the E3SM Wildfire model. And the reason for that is that we know the physics built in the is already in the E3SM, and including those functional relationships. So we want the data-driven machine learning model also sort of capture that relationship as a starting point, as a baseline. So we are not training a random relationship that just give us good prediction, but which could be totally not reasonable. So we start from a reasonable baseline and then train a model for each specific region. We also try training one single machine learning model for the whole globe, and also try for a finer regional specific machine learning model. But it turns out the GFAT region is the best trade-off that we can have enough training data for the machine learning model, but also we can have less machine learning model for each of the global simulation. And then we do a validation just for the model, just for the physical model, to make sure the data-driven model can mimic or can reproduce the physical model very well for each GFAT region, for each fire region. And for the US, it's the second group, the TINA, Temperate North American. So EESA basically overestimate a lot in terms of the learning area. And comparing the blue bar and the orange bar, we have the surrogate model, the DNA model, reproduce EESA very well. Then the second question is, how can we improve it? Because it's overestimate a lot. So we want to decrease the burn area. And we do that by putting, put the GFAT burn area data into this DNN and then fine-tune the model, and then do the research over a bunch of hyperparameters, and then figure out the best parameter set. And it turns out after the fine-tune, so the blue bar is the tuned DNN model, it does improve a lot. Although it also we also see some error comparing with the red bar, but it does improve a lot. Reduce the burn area for the TINA region, for North American, including California. And so that we have a better confidence about the model performance. That has, it has a physical constraint already, which is coming from the physical model. And also we have the predictability that's from the fine-tune step. And then we also look into the intraannual variability and the seasonal cycle. So if we just look at the red line and the green line, that's the observation and also the fine-tuned surrogate model. And we see that they agree much better with each other, comparing with the original EESA physical model and also the surrogate model. And left-hand side is the intraannual variability, and right-hand side is seasonal cycles. And we see that it gets improved a lot in over regions and over time and over the whole seasonal cycles. So that's pretty good. And then we do a final test. So we do a prognostic simulation of the model throughout the time that we don't train for, and then also compare with the observation, the GFAT observation. So the model can actually generalize pretty good. At least for the near future, we know the machine learning model always have the problem of generalizing to a unseen domain. And so it will give us an unrealistic prediction. But now, at least for the near future, from 2011 to 2015, it seems reasonable. Here is the latitudinal distribution of burn area, fractional burn area between the model and observation. So to summarize, from the modeling point of view, we can either use physical model, which we believe the physical principles are more or less reasonable, but the problem is parameterization, is how accurate we can generate the prediction based on the physical model. People usually deal with that with parameterization, so tune the physical parameters and find the optimal parameter set that can give us the best prediction. But that consumes a lot of time and also computational CPU hours. It's a lot of efforts. And the alternative approach is to combine this physical model with the machine learning approach, and that which is what we have tried in this study. So we surrogate the physical model with a neural network for the 14 GFAT regions, and then we can fine tune the surrogate model, which is very, very cheap in terms of computational time. It costs only a few hours to finish all the tuning, and can achieve very high accuracy. And it also we demonstrated it can be generalized very well, at least for near future, 2011 to 2014, in terms of burn area. And so the conclusion is that we can plug it back into the physical model and run the neural network model in the EESA big framework, so that we can study the feedbacks between fire and climate and other components of the Earth system. I also want to mention there are a few work that ongoing. Is that we noticed this approach is our first try. It's not a very not an optimal approach. We think we can put more physical constraint into this wildfire model, not just the functional constraint that's generated by the physical model. So that can be biased as well. So what we tried recently is to first infer the causal relationship between environmental factors and human activity and the burn area. And then so we know the strength and the time lag between those interactions. And then we use that interaction as a physical constraint in the machine learning framework. And so to make sure the machine learning framework can generate a good prediction, but at the same time, the cause-effect relationship, the lead-lag relationship are absolutely right. And so in other words, the model can capture the right prediction with the right reasons. That's what we care most about the machine learning model. And also we try to put some interpretability into the machine learning model so that we can directly analyze or diagnose what are the driving factors and what are the spatial distribution and temporal distribution or time lag, in other words, that affect the burn area predictions. And these works are ongoing, but I think they are more powerful than this original work that I just explained. We combine the physical model and the data-driven model. So that's all I wanted to share today. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Zhu. And then our third speaker from LBNL is Dr. Megan Simmons, and I'll turn it over to Megan. And Megan, I might note that you're muted.
Yep, there you go. Hi, everyone. I'm Megan. I'm a scientist at Berkeley Lab, and today I'm going to be sharing more of the management and land use dimensions of wildfire in California. So the title of the talk is Impacts of California's Climate-Relevant Land Use Policy Scenarios on Terrestrial Carbon Emissions and Wildfire Risk. And this was in collaboration with the state, the California Natural Resources Agency. So first, to provide some context, here's a figure showing annual emissions in teragrams of CO2 equivalents per year from 1990 to 2050 in California. The dots are gross emissions, And then there's 3 different greenhouse gas reduction targets that the state has mandated or set in executive orders. And this dashed line are the projected decrease to meet these targets over time. And one of the big question marks is how much can the landscape itself provide additional reductions by sequestering carbon or avoiding emissions, and get us closer to the net neutrality by 2045, which is a goal for the state, or even into the negative emissions territory. So subnational governments are all grappling with coming up with plans to mitigate emissions, decarbonize their states, and lack a cohesive platform to be able to incorporate land use planning into those strategies. One of the difficulties is that there's a lot of different land use priorities, some with competing aspects such as wildfire mitigation, which can actually emit more carbon than it reduces in terms of wildfire emissions reductions. The state also has agricultural productivity needs, needs for habitat area and water quality, among others. And so our goal was to develop a platform for the state to be able to use to quantify the impacts of their land use policy scenarios for the Natural and Working Lands Climate Change Implementation Plan for 2030. So our research objectives were to quantify the carbon emissions impacts and wildfire impacts of these realistic land use policy scenarios designed to meet multiple land use objectives, and to examine what the trade-offs are in them. And also to quantify the uncertainty in the emissions impacts, including interactions with climate change. So we developed the California Natural and Working Lands carbon and greenhouse gas model in order to do this. And this is an empirically based model, primarily a stock and flow model that also incorporates externally modeled data sets for wildfire, which are from Westerling, from California's 4th climate change assessment, and also land cover change data, both remote sensing based option and also a land use driven empirically modeled version to simulate. And also there are climate change impacts or scalars that you can assign to a scenario in order to simulate climate change effects on ecosystem carbon fluxes over time. And we have a detailed technical documentation and also user guide available, which I'll share a link for. So I won't go into this too much, but I will point out that the wildfire can affect land cover change through non-regeneration in the model. And that's based on empirical studies in California, looking at the burn severity and distance from the center of a burn patch, which took into account seed dispersal and the ability to reseed an area and the limitations to that. So management practices are for various different land types that are described in CALAND. And for forest management, that can affect wildfire by reducing the severity of wildfire, as well as increase annual carbon accumulation rates as well. So you can access CALAND and all of its documentation and input files for the results I'll share today on Zenodo and GitHub. There's also a model development paper that's in revision with +1, and that went into all of the individual sensitivity tests for the management practices and looking at the different sources of uncertainty in CALAND. And then we published a paper last month in Environmental Research Letters looking at our modeling analysis of the scenarios I'll be presenting today. So, sorry. So here we have the I'm laying out here the scenarios that we ran for that paper for the state's land use policy scenarios. We developed a baseline scenario that represented the lack of management and 2 levels of management that they included in their plan. Scenario A being mostly representing existing programs across the state, and scenario B looking at projected increases in available funding and capacity for implementation. And we ran them at 3 different climates, historical climate, RCP 4.5, and RCP 8.5. And this is just to point out like that RCP 8.5 is the highest, is predicted to have the highest increase in temperature with the highest concentrations of CO2 in the atmosphere for warming. And we also simulated it with 4.5, which is a lesser degree of climate change. And so that was 9 simulations, and to be able to capture the uncertainty, we ran the model 2 additional times to have a low and high emissions output, and that was based on uncertainty in the carbon inputs, the initial carbon densities, and the annual carbon fluxes. So here is a table of all the different practices that were simulated in scenarios A and B. They all covered the same practices, but at 2 different area extents, like I mentioned, and they were simulated from 2019 to 2030, except for forest management of fuel reduction practices and reforestation of all of the severely burned areas that wouldn't regenerate. Those were implemented through the remainder of the simulation to 2100 and repeated every 20 years for the fuel reduction activities. And all of these practices contribute to carbon sequestration and emissions reductions in some cases, except for forest fuel reduction, which, like I said before, will reduce the severity of wildfire, but it also emits a lot of carbon. So here are the results of the running the scenarios, the net cumulative change from baseline. These are scenario A and B with the 3 different climates shown in red, blue, and green. And this is a change from baseline in the no management scenario. So an increase or positive value is increased emissions, and negative is a net decrease relative to no management. And so you can see in the beginning of the implementation period from 2019 to about 2030, both scenarios A and B were net emitters. And that was due to the forest management practices to mitigate wildfire. But over time, the benefits of the other practices began to dominate and receive benefits throughout the rest of the century. And I want to point out that the climate change effects on the effect of these scenarios was minimal. It wasn't because there wasn't an effect of climate change on the individual scenarios, but the change in emissions was not strongly dependent on climate. It was much more dependent on the extent of the implementation areas, which was a function of what the state thought was feasible. And so now we're looking at scenario B, RCP 8.5, one of the lines in the previous graph, and looking again at changes in cumulative CO2 equivalents over time. And this is to give you an idea of what were the sources of those net changes in emissions. In this case, the fuel reduction activities were the cause of the increased emissions, and that is from both prescribed burning or controlled burning of harvest residue that's in the forest after treatments, decay of that biomass in the forest or in the sawmill, and also bioenergy production for some of the biomass that was removed. And that outweighed the benefits up until about 2030, at which point enhanced ecosystem carbon accumulation dominated. And most of this benefit was coming from the expansion of urban forest land, but some of it was due to avoided non-regeneration in the treated forest. And that's because with a reduction of the high severity wildfire emissions, which you can see here in red, you get the benefit of having more forest that's sequestering more carbon rather than converting to shrubland. And to look at that even further, we did a sensitivity test to isolate the effects and be able to demonstrate that, the effects of non-regeneration alone on the left, and then the effects of forest thinning alone on the right. So in this graph here, we're showing a change from baseline in annual emissions from a baseline that has full regeneration. So all of the high severity burnt areas do grow back as forest. And then the alternative scenario being some of the area being converted to shrubland and not regenerating. And so over time, you're going to have an increase in emissions, and that's due to the loss of that forest land. And if this was reforested, like it was in the scenarios for the state, this would then flip to a benefit compared to not reforesting. And on the right, we have the effect of forest thinning to show exactly what is contributing to the net impact of increasing emissions with that, and what is contributing to the benefits. So you can see there's some avoided high severity wildfire, and then also some enhanced carbon accumulation that's both from the enhanced growth of the forest, but also from some avoided non-regeneration. And now to bring it back to the context of the state's land use policies, which are shown in red and blue here. These are changes in annual emissions over time, and relative to the state's non-natural and working lands greenhouse gas reduction targets, you can see that there was a minimal contribution to these targets. And this wasn't too much of a surprise because the distribution or relative proportion of the wildfire mitigation needs of the state really outweighed the other extents of the other practices. So this was an opportunity to be able to explore further management areas for the other practices. So in conclusion, the primary constraint on emissions reductions potential of these scenarios, and any of the scenarios that we could run, is really the extent of the implementation areas for the strategies that increase carbon sequestration or avoid emissions. And to a lesser extent, there's some interactions with climate change. The carbon storage trade-offs with wildfire mitigation can't be offset alone with the reductions in wildfire emissions. So looking for opportunities to simultaneously offset those land emissions is going to be important if we really want to make a difference in using the landscape to get to net negative. All of these strategies do address climate change concerns and have multiple co-benefits, many that I didn't have a chance to discuss here. And they all can demonstrate the importance of land use change on climate change mitigation. And now that we have CALAND, there's implications and opportunities to be able to expand its capacity and explore new scenarios, and even adapt it to new regions, which currently we are collaborating with the Nature Conservancy to adapt CALAND to New Mexico and Colorado. And with that, thanks for listening. And I'd like to just acknowledge the funders and all of the contributions we had from the state agencies and public stakeholders in our steering and technical advising committees to develop CALAND.
Okay, thank you so much to all three of our speakers. It looks like we have a few questions to begin with, and I would ask that folks that have questions continue to put them in the Q&A box at the bottom. And if it's directed at an individual, please try and include that. So let's see, we have, okay. Oh, okay, I see. Dr. Mekonnen has actually been answering some of these questions through typing while we've been presenting here. We haven't had this before, so I think what we'll do is go ahead and answer the unanswered questions first and try and do this all aloud so everybody can benefit from the answers. So we have a question from, looks like Luis Vidal. How does wildfire mitigation emit more carbon than store it? I'm going to guess that's a question for you, Megan.
So it's how does it emit more than?
So the question reads, how does wildfire mitigation emit more carbon than store?
So the practices of prescribed burning, thinning, or understory treatment, which are prescribed in CALAND, they're all practices that remove biomass from the forest, and so that in of itself is going to emit carbon. The issue is how much wildfire would have happened and emitted without that practice versus with it. And it turns out that the reductions in wildfire emissions don't outweigh the amount of forest biomass that's removed from the forest. So that's why there's more emissions.
Let's see, and we have a question here from Nicholas Johnson, who asks, hi, Dr. Simmons, I think this was sort of covered. And is this looking at current prescribed burn levels, or is this assuming an increase in prescribed burns? So that's a great question, right? I have read that there needs to be millions of acres of prescribed burns and fuel reduction, but California only does approximately thousands of acres annually. So I was curious to see how that worked into your models and what's a realistic goal for reducing emissions while also increasing controlled burns.
Yeah, this definitely is modeling the goals that the state has to have millions of acres treated, and at two different levels. So yeah, it's definitely above and beyond what's currently being done.
Do you have a, and this may be a sort of a too specific for a model question, but is this generally trying to hit a certain level or just a X number increase over what's the current approach?
I think it was about 1 million hectares or more. I'd have to, I think in my presentation, I had what the goal was, the total. Quick, go back to it.
And feel free to share your screen again if you want to.
I would have to get back to whoever that is because it's not in,
okay.
Or in the discussion we can look at the paper. Yeah.
So Nicholas, if you're able to join us in the discussion, we can get into this in a little bit more depth. That's a very important question. And we have a question from Marty Witter down Southern California, who asks, what are the strategies for the 6 million hectares of chaparral and the CSS shrublands?
Well, that's a good question, but we did not include treatment of these other land types, just forest. So I'm not sure.
Okay. Other questions? Not many questions today, people stunned. Okay, let's see, we have a question from Benet Dara Abrams, I'm sorry. What fraction of the total California carbon sequestration is currently stored in the California wildland urban interface? You mentioned, I think that's probably related to, you mentioned that a lot of this depends on urban forests, right? And so a lot of those areas are going to be associated with wildland urban interface. Do you have an idea of sort of what fraction of this is in those urban and peri-urban areas?
No, I don't. I mean, one of the things with CALAND is that the wild urban interface is not distinct. So we have urban area and a certain fraction of that is urban forest. which has like a lot of potential if we're expanding the urban forest to sequester carbon. But I don't know what the current stored carbon is in that.
Other questions from folks? I guess I'll ask a question. I like many folks that are listening, you know, I've been interested in and myself bombarded with this question of the trade-offs between the forest thinning and management practices, and particularly controlled burning, right? And then how that offsets emissions from wildfires down the road. And if you, based on the model, if you were going to try and give a short, simple answer to sort of the broader general public of, okay, well, you know, yes, we're going to do some emissions now associated with burning based on those targets that you've put in there. And what is the sort of approximate savings in emissions from wildfire, from the sources that you mentioned, the avoidance of high severity wildfire and some of the regeneration thing? Is it like a 1-to-1 trade-off? Is it a 3-to-1, 2-to-1? I mean, any ideas of sort of what the ratio looks like?
Yeah, if I remember correctly, it's pretty surprising, because you would think you would be saving a lot more in wildfire emissions, but it was really only, I think it was less than 10% of what you were emitting that you were saving in reductions in wildfire emissions. But over time, as the forests are thinned, the fraction of carbon that you're removing with these practices amounts to less biomass, because there's less to remove. And so maybe in a couple hundred years or so, we'll have forests that are much more restored to their original wildfire regimes and the status there. So the impact of doing occasional burns isn't going to be as detrimental, potentially.
In the carbon storage context, at least.
Yeah.
Okay, so we are coming right up on 4 o'clock. I see we have another question in here from Steve Quarles, and we'll go ahead and move that over to the discussion. So in the chat box is the link for the discussion for those of you that are able to join us with our 3 panelists, our 3 speakers today over in the discussion. Please click on that link. Thank you all, and please join me in giving a round of applause to our speakers. Great, I love learning about the models, because this is the thing I don't understand as well. So I really appreciate our 3 speakers today. And just a quick reminder, next week, 10 a.m. special time for our guest from Switzerland. So with that, we'll wrap up for the week. Thank you to our 3 speakers, and we'll go ahead and move it over to the Zoom discussion room for those of you that are able to join us. Thank you so much, speakers.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you for organizing this.